The champagne flute trembled in Eleanor Gray's hand. Her knuckles, gnarled with 80 years of life, were white. Outside, the storm raged. Rain lashed against the tall, mullioned windows of Blackwood Manor. Inside, the fire in the grand dining room hearth crackled and spat, casting long dancing shadows on the faces gathered around the polished mahogany table. It was her birthday, a milestone, a celebration. Yet the air was thick, not with joy, but with a tension so palpable it felt like another guest. Eleanor looked at each face, her children and grandchildren, their expressions a mixture of forced smiles and thinly veiled greed. She knew what they were thinking. They were waiting. They were all waiting. She cleared her throat, the sound frail against the storm's fury. "To family," she began, her voice a reedy whisper. For all its complexities, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. It was a knowing smile, one that held 80 years of secrets. She raised her glass higher. Her gaze lingered on her eldest son Richard, his jaw tight. Then it shifted to her daughter Catherine, who adjusted her pearls with nervous fingers. Even the grandchildren, usually so full of life, sat in stiff silence. The room held its breath, waiting for the toast to conclude, waiting for the performance of family unity to be over. The weight of unspoken words pressed down on them all. Eleanor's eyes, once a vibrant blue, now clouded and distant, scanned the room one last time. They passed over the familiar faces and settled on a stranger at the far end of the table, a man no one had expected. Mr. Alistair Finch. His presence was a puzzle, a final deliberate move in her long and complicated game. She took a small deliberate sip from her glass. Her hand faltered. The crystal flute slipped from her grasp, shattering on the stone floor with a sharp, final sound. Her eyes widened, not in surprise, but in a dawning, horrifying realization. A gasp escaped her lips, a choked, desperate sound. She slumped forward, her silver head came to rest amongst the fine china and untouched cake. The silence that followed was more profound than the storm's roar. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. For a moment, no one moved. They simply stared, frozen in a tableau of shock and disbelief. The matriarch of the Grey family, the formidable Eleanor, was gone. The storm outside had trapped them. The storm inside had just begun. Her sudden, quiet exit was not an ending. It was a beginning. A terrible, dark beginning in a house full of secrets. The storm was not merely a backdrop, it was a character in this unfolding drama. It was a beast, clawing at the ancient stone of Blackwood Manor. The wind howled like a mournful wolf, a sound that seeped through every crack and crevice of the old house. Rain, driven by the gale, hammered against the windows, not in gentle drops but in solid sheets of water. It turned the world outside into a blurry, indistinct watercolor of gray and black. The long, winding drive that led to the main road was already a river of mud and debris. The phone lines had gone dead an hour ago. The internet had followed soon after. They were utterly, completely alone. The isolation settled upon the house like a shroud. Blackwood Manor, usually a symbol of the Grey family's power and influence, had become their prison. Its grand halls and opulent rooms, once meant to impress, now felt cavernous and menacing. Shadows stretched and twisted in the flickering candlelight, the power having failed just as dessert was served. Each creak of the floorboards, each rattle of a window pane in its frame, sounded like a footstep, a whisper, a threat. The atmosphere grew thick with suspicion and fear. Every person in the house was now a potential suspect, trapped with the others in a gilded cage. The family members, once united by the pretense of celebration, now scattered. They moved through the darkened house like ghosts. Richard paced the length of the library, his face a mask of controlled fury, the firelight catching the glint of his expensive watch. Catherine retreated to her late mother's sitting room, sinking into a velvet armchair and weeping, though whether her tears were for her mother or for her own uncertain future was unclear. The grandchildren, young adults who had arrived expecting a weekend of feigned pleasantries, huddled together in the drawing room, their hushed conversations punctuated by nervous glances toward the dining room. The house itself seemed to be watching them. Portraits of stern-faced Grey ancestors stared down from the walls, their painted eyes following every movement. The air, heavy with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and damp stone, now carried a new, metallic tang, the scent of fear. The storm had sealed them in, locking them away from the outside world. It had stripped away the thin veneer of civility, leaving only the raw, ugly truths that had festered beneath the surface for years. Blackwood Manor was no longer a home, it was a crucible, and the storm was the fire that would test them all. At the head of the family, or what was left of it, stood Richard Gray. He was the eldest, a man who wore his ambition like a well-tailored suit. His business was failing, a fact he had carefully concealed from his mother. He had come to this birthday dinner hoping for a lifeline, a final, generous investment from the family matriarch. Now, with Eleanor gone, his gaze was fixed on the inheritance. His motive was stark and simple: survival. He saw her death not as a tragedy, but as a brutal, necessary solution to his financial woes. His grief was a performance, his concern a carefully constructed lie. He needed the money, and he would do anything to secure it. His sister Catherine was a different creature entirely. She had lived her life in her mother's formidable shadow, always seeking an approval that was rarely given. She had married a man Eleanor despised, a secret she had carried for decades. Her motive was not money, but freedom. She yearned to escape the crushing weight of her mother's judgment, to finally live a life of her own choosing. She harbored a deep, simmering resentment, born from a lifetime of perceived slights and disappointments. Her quiet demeanor hid a rage that had been building for years, a silent storm that rivaled the one outside the manor walls. Then there were the grandchildren, Liam and Clara. They were not children but young adults caught in the crossfire of their family's dysfunction. Liam, Richard's son, was a gambler. He was deep in debt to dangerous people, a secret he had guarded with desperate care. He saw his grandmother's fortune as his only way out, a quick fix for a problem that threatened to consume him. Clara, Catherine's daughter, was an idealist. She had recently discovered a series of letters that revealed a devastating family betrayal committed by Eleanor years ago, a secret that had shattered her idealized image of her grandmother. Her motive was justice, a desire to see old wrongs righted no matter the cost. Each family member stood over Eleanor's memory like a vulture circling its prey. Their grief was a cloak for their true desires. The inheritance was the prize, a vast fortune that could solve all their problems. But it was more than just money. It was about power, freedom, and revenge. The secrets they kept were not just personal failings, they were weapons, loaded and aimed at one another. In the suffocating confines of the storm-swept manor, these hidden motives began to surface, poisoning the air and turning family into foes. The battle for the Grey fortune had begun. Sitting at the far end of the table, a silent observer to the family's implosion was Mr. Alistair Finch. He was the mystery, the uninvited guest. He was a quiet man in his late 50s with watchful eyes and an air of quiet confidence that seemed entirely out of place amidst the rising panic. No one in the family knew who he was or why Eleanor had insisted on his presence at her final dinner. He had been introduced simply as an old friend, a vague description that only deepened the suspicion surrounding him. He was Eleanor's lawyer, and he carried with him a document that would change everything, a newly revised will. Mr. Finch's role was to be the executor of Eleanor's final wishes. He was the keeper of her last, most powerful secret. He knew the contents of the will, a document that she had changed just days before her death. He had been instructed to read it to the family only after her passing. His presence was a calculated move by Eleanor, a final piece placed on the chessboard of her life. He was not a suspect in the traditional sense, but his knowledge made him a central figure in the unfolding mystery. He held the key to the primary motive, the inheritance, and his silence made him a target for the family's growing paranoia and desperation. The detective arrived, not in a squad car with flashing lights, but on foot, drenched and weary. Detective Inspector Ben Carter had been visiting his sister in the nearby village when the storm hit. He was off duty, seeking refuge from his own troubled past. The Gray family was not just another case for him, he had a personal connection. His father had once been the groundskeeper at Blackwood Manor, and Ben had spent his childhood playing in its vast gardens, a world away from the opulent life within its walls. He knew the family, or at least the image they presented to the world. He was a reluctant detective, drawn into a web he had long since tried to escape. Carter's connection to the Grays gave him a unique perspective. He was not an outsider, yet he was not one of them. He could see past the polished veneer to the rot beneath. He remembered a younger, kinder Eleanor before bitterness had taken root. He knew Richard's arrogance and Catherine's quiet sadness from his youth. This personal history was both an advantage and a burden. It allowed him to navigate the family's complex dynamics, but it also clouded his judgment with memories and old loyalties. Trapped by the storm, with no backup and no access to forensic resources, Ben Carter had to rely on his wits, his memories, and his understanding of the dark secrets that houses like Blackwood Manor always kept. The investigation began not in an interrogation room, but in the hushed, candlelit corners of the manor. Detective Carter, armed with only a notepad and a weary determination, started to peel back the layers of the Gray family's carefully constructed facade. His interviews were informal, conducted in the library, by the fire, or in the cold, sterile kitchen. Each conversation was a delicate dance of evasion and revelation. Richard was dismissive, his answers clipped and impatient. He spoke of his mother's failing health, suggesting her death was nothing more than a tragic natural event. But Carter saw the flicker of desperation in his eyes, the subtle tremor in his hand as he reached for a glass of whiskey. Catherine, on the other hand, was a fountain of sorrowful anecdotes, painting a picture of a difficult but beloved mother. She spoke in circles, her grief a shield against direct questions. Yet, when Carter gently probed about her marriage, a flash of anger broke through her sad demeanor. It was a fleeting expression, quickly masked, but it did not go unnoticed. She spoke of her mother's controlling nature, the constant interference, the feeling of never being good enough. Her whispers in the dark were not of love, but of a deep, abiding resentment that had festered for decades. The alliances, it seemed, were already fragile. The grandchildren, Liam and Clara, offered a different perspective. Liam was jittery, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting an unseen threat. He talked too much, too quickly about his grandmother's generosity, a story that rang hollow. When Carter asked about his recent trips to the city, Liam became defensive, his story full of holes. Clara was the opposite. She was quiet, watchful, and her grief seemed genuine. She hesitated before confiding in Carter, eventually showing him the letters she had found. They revealed that Eleanor had cheated a business partner decades ago, the grandfather of Alistair Finch, ruining the man and his family. The secret cast a long, dark shadow over Eleanor's legacy. As the hours wore on, the tension in the house escalated. The initial shock gave way to a creeping paranoia. Family members who had arrived as a united front now looked at each other with suspicion. Alliances, forged over a lifetime, began to fracture. Richard and Catherine, once allies against their mother's domineering presence, now saw each other as rivals for the inheritance. Liam, desperate for cash, eyed his father's potential fortune with a predatory glint. The whispers in the dark were turning into accusations, and the Grand Manor was becoming a pressure cooker of fear and greed. Suspense thickened the air like the storm clouds outside. The initial theory of a natural death began to crumble under the weight of small, unsettling discoveries. While searching Eleanor's bedroom for any medication she might have been taking, I found her personal journal. The last entry, written on the morning of her birthday, was chilling. "He knows," it read. "After all these years, he knows. I must make it right before it's too late. Finch is my only hope." The "he was not" identified, leaving a cloud of suspicion hanging over every man in the house, her son, her grandson, and the mysterious lawyer. The investigation then turned to the champagne flute. I carefully examined the shattered pieces on the dining room floor and noticed a faint, oily residue near the rim of the largest shard. It was almost invisible, something easily missed in the chaotic aftermath. I had no way to test it, but my instincts screamed poison. This was not a heart attack, this was murder. The realization sent a fresh wave of fear through the house. The storm had not just trapped us with a dead body, it had trapped us with a killer. The stakes were suddenly terrifyingly higher. As my quiet investigation progressed, the family's fragile unity shattered completely. Richard, upon learning of the new will from a tight-lipped Mr. Finch, flew into a rage. He confronted his sister Catherine, accusing her of manipulating their mother. Their argument, loud and vicious, echoed through the grand hall, their angry words revealing years of jealousy and bitterness. They spoke of betrayals, of promises broken, and of a deep-seated rivalry that had been simmering just beneath the surface. Each saw the other as the most likely to have committed the desperate act. New dangers emerged from the shadows. Liam, growing more agitated by the hour, was caught by me trying to force open his grandmother's safe, his face a mask of sweat and panic. He confessed his gambling debts, revealing that he owed a sum that would ruin him. He believed the safe held cash that could save him. His desperation made him a prime suspect. At the same time, Clara, armed with the knowledge from the letters, confronted Mr. Finch, accusing him of being there for revenge, not reconciliation. The house was no longer just a crime scene, it was a battlefield, with shifting alliances and hidden threats at every turn. I felt as though I were trying to untangle a tapestry woven from decades of lies. Each thread I pulled seemed to reveal another, more complex knot, I brought the family together in the library, the fire casting flickering, accusatory shadows on their faces. I laid out the facts as I knew them, the journal entry, the residue on the glass, the motive of the new will. I watched their reactions, searching for the flicker of guilt, the telltale sign of a liar. Richard blustered, denying everything with the force of a man used to getting his way. Catherine wept, retreating into her role as the grieving daughter. The focus shifted to Alistair Finch. Under my persistent questioning, the quiet lawyer finally broke his silence. His grandfather had indeed been ruined by Eleanor Gray. He had lost everything and had died a broken man. Finch admitted that he had sought Eleanor out, not for revenge, but for an apology, for some acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done to his family. Eleanor, consumed by guilt in her final days, had agreed. The new will, he revealed, was her attempt at atonement. It left a significant portion of her fortune to a charitable trust established in his grandfather's name, drastically reducing the shares for her children. This revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Richard and Catherine stared at Finch, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and fury. The prize they had been circling, the inheritance they had coveted, had been snatched away. Their primary motive for wanting their mother gone had, in fact, been created by the very act they were suspected of committing. If they had killed her before she signed the new will, they would have inherited everything under the old one. But Finch confirmed that Eleanor had signed the new documents that very afternoon, with him as a witness. Her death had sealed their fate, not secured it. The tapestry of lies began to unravel. Richard's financial desperation was laid bare. Catherine's deep-seated resentment was exposed. Liam's gambling debts became public knowledge. Clara's righteous anger faltered as she saw the real-world consequences of digging up the past. Each secret, once a private burden, was now a public accusation. They turned on each other, their words like daggers. The family's carefully curated image was destroyed, leaving only the ugly, raw truth of their greed and dysfunction. Yet amidst the chaos, I realized a crucial piece was still missing. The motive, as we understood it, was flawed. The storm outside was beginning to break. The relentless howling of the wind softened to a low moan, and slivers of pale morning light pierced the gloom. It was in this quiet, gray dawn that the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for me. I had been so focused on the new will, on the grand motives of greed and revenge, that I had overlooked something smaller, more personal. I remembered the shattered glass, but also the detail of Eleanor's final moments. She had taken a sip, just one small sip. But poison, especially a fast-acting one, would have been in the whole glass. Why had no one else been affected? I walked back into the silent dining room, the scene of the crime. The table was still a mess of plates and glasses. I looked at Eleanor's place setting, at the single overturned champagne flute. Then my eyes moved to her water glass, still full. I thought about the residue I had found, an oily substance. I recalled Catherine's nervous habit, the way she constantly adjusted her pearls, the way her hands were never still. I remembered her weeping in her mother's sitting room, a room filled with Eleanor's personal effects, including her vast collection of perfumes and essential oils. I found Catherine in the conservatory, staring out at the rain-washed gardens. I spoke softly, not as a detective, but as a man who understood grief and regret. I asked her about the oil, lily of the valley. It was her mother's favorite scent, but it was also a potent cardiotoxin, highly poisonous if ingested. Catherine's composure finally broke. She hadn't meant to kill her. She confessed through racking sobs that she had only wanted to frighten her, to cause a small, non-fatal heart palpitation that would scare Eleanor into realizing how much stress she was causing her daughter. She had wanted her mother to finally see her, to need her. She had put a tiny drop of the concentrated lily of the valley oil on the rim of the champagne flute, thinking Eleanor would taste it, be startled, and put the glass down. It was a foolish, desperate act, born of a lifetime of feeling invisible. She never imagined her elderly mother, with her frail heart, would have such a catastrophic reaction. It wasn't a calculated murder for inheritance. It was a cry for attention that had gone horribly, tragically wrong. The final thread of the mystery was not one of greed, but of a twisted, desperate love and a longing for recognition that had curdled into a fatal act. As the last of the clouds parted, casting a clean, bright sunlight across the drenched grounds of Blackwood Manor, a profound and somber quiet settled over the family. The truth, now exposed, was uglier and sadder than any of their suspicions. Catherine sat in a state of shock, the full weight of her actions crashing down upon her. There was no triumph for Richard, only the bitter taste of his own greed and the public humiliation of his financial ruin. The inheritance, now mostly diverted to Finch's charity, was a moot point. The fortune they had coveted had become a symbol of their collective moral bankruptcy. The arrival of the local police, their cars finally able to navigate the cleared driveway, was a quiet, procedural affair. I gave my statement and Catherine was led away, offering no resistance. She seemed almost relieved, as if the burden of her secret was heavier than any legal consequence. Mr. Finch, his family's name finally cleared and his grandfather's memory honored, prepared to depart. He left not with a sense of victory, but with a deep melancholy for the destruction he had witnessed. The Gray family, as a powerful dynasty, was finished, its secrets laid bare for the world to see. For the remaining family members, the future was an uncertain landscape. Richard would have to face his creditors without the safety net of his mother's fortune. Liam, his desperation exposed, would have to find another way to deal with his debts. Clara, who had sought justice, was left with the ashes of her family's legacy, a hard lesson in the destructive power of secrets. The storm had passed, but it had irrevocably altered the terrain of their lives. They were no longer the formidable Greys of Blackwood Manor, but a collection of broken people, adrift in the wreckage of their own making. I stood on the manor's front steps, watching the last of the police cars disappear down the drive. The air was fresh and clean. I had solved the mystery, but there was no satisfaction in it. I had uncovered not a monster, but a tragedy of human frailty. The Gray family mystery was not a story of a cunning killer, but a sad tale of loneliness, desperation, and the quiet violence that can fester within a family. As I walked away from the grand house of my childhood memories, I knew that some storms cleanse the world, while others simply reveal the devastation that was already there.